Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, April 8th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one, World Trade Center 7, the third tower that collapsed on 9/11. Today is part two, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele, the host of 9/11 Freefall also. Hey, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. And yeah, we got a really good guest this week on the show, a retired explosives expert. So everyone's going to want to tune into that. But just want to let everyone know I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is in the questions and information form, which is online at ae911truth.org. Just go up to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking out on YouTube and Facebook for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get right into it, shall we? The Twin Towers, in terms of design, some called it the crowning achievement of the international style. Others called it heartless modernism, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, and overshadowing the tallest building in the world at the time, which was the Empire State Building. In terms of design, notice the unfolding massing of this beautiful Art Deco style high rise. They just don't make them anymore like they used to. There were some incredible engineering innovations, though, right off the bat, beginning with the elevators themselves, because they had to get 100,000 occupants in both towers up to their occupancy. Hold on one second. I hit the wrong button. There we go. Nope, there's not. We go. Let's go. Oh, fascinating. Let's go there. So, oh, I see what happened here. Hold on one second. And there we go. So they accomplished this in 3 tiers, and with almost 100 elevator cabs in each of these towers, getting also 140,000 occupants or visitors to their place of where they're heading. It's an incredible feat. Even greater than that was the structural innovations here, because in high rises up to this point, they had a forest of columns, as you just saw. With the Twin Towers, they pushed half the columns to the outside, and they were welded in the factory, 3 high, 3 vertical three vertical, three horizontal, and then bolted in turn at the site. And so we have quite an easy time erecting this in terms of efficiency. In the middle, incredible series of 47 core columns, 2 inches thick at the mid height, as you just saw, and in between spanning are these lightweight steel trusses that span 60 feet on one side, like here, and then 35 feet on the other sides. So what we have then is a here we go, 200 feet square. That's an acre in size, these floor plates with open office planning. As you can see here, it's an amazing feat, allowing the tenants to lay out their offices without restriction in terms of columns. It's quite extraordinary. There are some downsides here. The floor to ceiling height felt low to many occupants, oppressive, and the columns marched all the way around the outside every 3 feet 4 inches, leaving only a 2-foot window slot, which some likened to a jail cell. So they were less popular as additional skyscrapers with greater engineering innovations came in the 80s and 90s. And so the occupant rate was actually quite low, according to some researchers, only half full at the time at the time of 9/11. But also the New York City was requiring legally the Port Authority to renovate the asbestos, which was really quite a problem in this building. So we have probably $5 to $10 billion, according to different estimates of that cost, and then another $10 billion to $15 billion in upgrades of mechanical, electrical, and communication systems. So this was really quite a problem for the Port Authority. So they transferred it to private ownership in a deal that Larry Silverstein invested only $15 million of his own money in, and leveraging that to $3.2 billion. At which time he then, just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, and then he put his massive terrorist insurance on the building, and walked away with $5.68 billion. So from 15 million to 5.68 billion, he did very, very well. So anyway, that's an interesting piece of history there. But let's go back a little, not quite back so far, and see what happened that morning, how this official myth was developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell, and we're going to examine that in detail today. Where did it come from? Maybe that guy on the street, because engineers worked for months and years and are still working to understand what really happened there. But here's this bozo with the Fox News hat, due to fire, because mostly due to structural weakening because the fire was so intense. So the first person interviewed that day. Okay, hold on one second. I've got to do a quick change here, and we'll come right back. And slideshow from current. There we go. That's going to help me out. Now, we had investigations. Oh, let's go back. We have the North Tower hit at 8:46 in the morning. It collapses over an hour and a half later. A lot of people equate the massive explosion of jet fuel with the collapse of the towers, but no. Even Nist acknowledges. Nist is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And even they acknowledge that 90% of the jet fuel burned up outside the building. The rest of it was gone in just 10 minutes. So we have, for over an hour, normal office fires in these buildings and a few broken columns from the airplanes. So this is important to realize. Now, the North Tower was hit 15 stories down from the top of this 110-story building. The South Tower was hit about 30 stories down. So by flight 175, it collapses just an hour later. So there were some investigations into these collapses, beginning right away with hand-picked volunteers who worked themselves into the subsequent FEMA investigation and into the Nist investigation after that, many of them. So these are not independent investigations that we have here. Even with the FEMA team, the New York Times documents that their efforts were quite hampered with restrictions to getting access to the blueprints, to the site itself, and to the public for photographs and videos. Nist came after that, who's Nist never having been involved in a building failure analysis or investigation, nevertheless was put in charge of this catastrophe, and they had $20 million to do it. They were tasked by Congress to explain the collapses. We'll see today that they did nothing of the kind. They are part of the U.S. executive branch of government and under the Department of Commerce. And so the leadership of the Department of Commerce and Nist was changed out when the Bush administration came to power shortly, well, a year before 9/11. So their theory is a column failure theory. They suggest that the raging fires caused the floor trusses to sag. And when they did, that pulled in the columns, the perimeter columns. So the problem here is that sagging floor trusses don't have the force necessary to pull in these 14-inch square steel tube columns. And so what does Nist do? They, in their computer model, forced them to fail with an artificial 5,000-pound load on all the columns all the way around the building at once, forcing them, or at least at the connection to the steel truss, at each truss, which is like every third column, forcing them to fail and allowing this heavy object up above to theoretically crush the building below. But as we'll see, they never did any analysis on the capability of the upper block to crush the lower block. We'll come back to that. But are the fires raging? The photographs and videos show us that they're diminished at the time of the collapse. So the scenario can't possibly be happening. Surely the failure of all the columns all the way around the building. The thick black smoke indicates that these are oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. What is that? We have a question. How do the towers come down? We do some background research. How have other towers come down, for instance? We do make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. This is our best guess as to how the tower came down. We all the rational hypotheses are laid out without respect to our personal, financial, or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter. Jet planes is certainly one rational reason. The broken columns, for instance, the ensuing fires started by the jet fuel, and explosions are another rational hypothesis, as you'll see abundant evidence for today. Controlled demolition in particular, lots and lots of evidence we'll be looking at today and next week. So we make predictions based on these hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new one. and so forth, and we go through the process again until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the experiments, the results, etc., until we have one that works. And so that's what we're about today, a new hypothesis. But let's look at the forces that have destroyed buildings as part of our background research in the past. Fire is certainly a force that destroys buildings. It's an organic, chaotic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, moves on looking for fresh new combustibles. Now, 20 minutes is a figure that even Nist acknowledges. In a given area, that's all the fuel there is to burn in one location. So the fires aren't raging for an indefinite amount of time in any given area, as they go on to suggest, as we'll see. In fact, we haven't lost a skyscraper that is a steel-framed, fireproof skyscraper in the history of steel-framed, fireproof skyscrapers. But now on 9/11, we have not two, but three, as we saw last week, steel-framed, fireproof skyscrapers that have collapsed. And so this should be an extraordinarily studied. There should be extraordinary evidence for a hypothesis that is unprecedented. In the case of wood frame buildings, of course, the structure itself is combustible. We would expect the structure to be destroyed and it would fall over, probably. Not straight down through the path of greatest resistance anyway, the tons of structure, cold, hard, and intact beneath the fire. Now, we have, in the case of steel frame buildings, a series of tests that are rather extraordinary. British Steel, Cardington, UK, they built an 8-story building like this out of both fireproofed steel and unfireproofed steel, because they wanted to know what would happen in the absolute worst case also. They put extraordinary fuel loads on the inside the building to try to get those temperatures up to 2,000 degrees, which is very, very difficult to do. And what happened? Well, note that we do have unfireproofed beams, in this case, a fireproof column, and lots of testing that has been done here. And what they found is that the beams will warp, particularly the unfireproofed beams, as you see here, but the connections are solid. They don't fail. And yet that is what was blamed for the failure of Building 7 in particular. The executive summary cites that this is an inherently stable behavior in steel frame buildings due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form, which is the reason we have not lost one of dozens of very hot, much larger and longer lasting fires in these buildings. Let's take a look at them.
May 4th, 1988, the first Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, none of them did. Not even these fires post 9/11, which are fully engulfed in these buildings. Fires do not bring steel frame skyscrapers that are fireproofed down. It just doesn't happen. And so hang on one second. Oh, okay. I'm going to fix that. And there we go. So compare those again to these fires, which are diminished at the time of the collapse. So we have a real problem here supporting the official story, and this is just the beginning. Let's look at some buildings that did collapse due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. These buildings fell over. They're certainly badly damaged, but they're not pancaked into an unrecognizable building. It's easily recognizable. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. Let's put that aside for a moment because we'll be comparing how the towers looked and the aftermath. Now, these buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that are expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the gases, from the chemical explosions, the chemical reactions in the explosions. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. We'll be looking at these features in reference to the Twin Towers. We also have a nice case history of controlled demolitions where explosives can be engineered quite effectively to bring down tall buildings. This is the only way of, well, it is the main way of bringing down tall buildings intentionally, and the only way that most tall buildings have come down. So they place these shaped cutter charges at various key elements of the columns and beams in the building and set them off in synchronized order, bringing them down in however they want to. They can favor one side or it can go straight down, whatever they want to do. There's a set of features associated with these, which we're going to look at. And there's only a handful of companies in the United States that can even accomplish this. We begin with a set of features. Number one, there's a sudden onset of destruction the building begins to fall. It doesn't fall in stages because they take out the columns, which removes the structure that was supporting it. So there's a straight down, often, if that's what they want to do, a fairly symmetrical collapse anyway, into the building's footprint. There's the patterned removal of column supports. That's how they get that symmetry. And this results often in a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of steel structure in the way, but it's been removed. So it falls as fast as a bowling ball often, resulting also in the total dismemberment of the steel frame structure. The columns and beams are severed one from another. If you have this, you know you have intentional demolition. Feature 6, of course, there's one of the features of controlled demolition, limited damage to adjacent structures. You don't want to damage surrounding structures. And there's witnesses that hear explosions. They see flashes of light. This is indicative, of course, of explosions. The floors are broken up, if not pulverized, in overdone controlled demolitions where dust can be a problem. But you want to break up that floor. You don't have to go back into those floors and jackhammer them at all odd angles. Very dangerous work. Feature 9, there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the explosive demolition industry. They are obviously explosions. They go off perhaps prematurely, perhaps at different areas. We'll be looking at lots of those today in the Twin Towers. And feature number 10, we have evidence left behind of explosive devices and or residue of explosions, in this case, incendiaries. We'll be specifically looking at that in 2 weeks from today when we get to part 3 of this 3-part series. So this is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. The fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance, and never before with a steel frame high-rise, as we've mentioned. Why not? Well, one reason is that steel conducts that heat away from its source, so it never really gets to the 1200 degree Fahrenheit critical temperature at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. So that's a real problem, so we put cementitious fireproofing on the beams. 4 to 6 times as much as we'll ever need. That's 2-hour fire protection on the beams and 3-hour fire protection on the columns. That's a lot more than the 20 minutes a fire can even remain in a given area, given the fuel that it burns up and moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So we also build these buildings out of non-combustible, and steel is a prime example of a non-combustible material. And the contents that tenants can bring in, we regulate that rather strictly. And just to keep all that from ever becoming a problem, we put fire sprinklers in these buildings also, which puts out the fire immediately. In the case of the Twin Towers, it said that the elevator shaft penetration by the airplane was responsible for severing the fire sprinklers. And that may or may not be true. What we do here is focus on the evidence for controlled demolition. So with government documentation, that can be very helpful if we have it. In some cases we do. Foreknowledge of the destruction, people know that a controlled demolition is imminent. You don't just bring down a building in an afternoon or a day. It takes months of preparation, so people know about it in advance. Experts agree that it's a controlled demolition, at least those experts without financial or political obligation that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether it's a controlled demolition or not. A very important factor in our in the analysis of any so-called objective opinion. such as, for instance, the demolition companies in the United States, which rely on federal grants for most of their work in controlled demolition. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that will apply step by step to the Twin Towers. Let's begin with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts? In this case, not at the base of the building like we saw in Building 7, but they can go anywhere they want, as you'll see, to begin a controlled demolition. Note that it's standing still, and all of a sudden it is in uniform downward motion. That there is no halting or hesitation, as the building would be expected as it impacted structure, intact structure below. So no, it's all of a sudden in uniform motion. Same with the South Tower. It's standing still, and all of a sudden it is in downward uniform smooth motion. We'll look at the specifics of that motion in a moment. Is there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Feature number 2. Well, let's go to the Fire Commissioner Thomas von Essen, who ordered the collective the oral histories to be recorded by his first responders. In fact, 500 of them within a month and a half. And these came out in 2005. We couldn't even see or hear these recordings before because the city of New York was hiding them. But the New York Times sued the city to get them released. And indeed, the New York Court State of Appeals forced them to release this. And what did we find? Not we, but a very hardworking researcher, Graham McQueen, who revealed that 118 of these firefighters were observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena of demolition. And now it's, by the way, even more than that. We felt the ground shake, one of these witnesses said. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, you're going to hear the order of these events, which is very specific from these witnesses about the timing of them. The phenomena occurs, seeing or hearing, and before the towers came down. Here again, all of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all four sides. Material shot out horizontally, and then there appeared to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building, there was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another, and then it hit about the 5th floor. I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a flash. Hang on one second. Okay. Let's look at the South Tower, the North Tower, and see if there's any similarity. What are they talking about? Is there any similarity to a known controlled demolition? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Especially since fire, the official cause of these buildings' collapses, has never brought down a steel frame skyscraper, ever. Should not controlled demolition have been the first hypothesis, if not the only rational one? But no, it was relegated to a set of very frequently asked questions years later, put up on the website of Nist. Why didn't Nist consider a controlled demolition hypothesis? Well, they have all kinds of appeals to authority here. We had 200 technical experts, 125 leading experts, examined 7,000 photographs, interviewed more than 1,000 people. Wow, that's impressive. Video evidence also showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. In other words, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. We'll see about that. Nist found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition. That's what we're going to be showing you today. Overwhelming, abundant, and irrefutable evidence that they were brought down that way. Let's continue with it. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and you hear the pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building, it started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief light sources, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. You actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building, and then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower and see what they're talking about here. Is there any resemblance to the known controlled demolition on the left? Let's slow it down halfway. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors. Then there are a series of smaller explosions which appear to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with large fireball, which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Do you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at that point was still thought that these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these credible witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
a huge explosion now waiting to bring on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire.
bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion, and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom.
And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor started popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Like firecrackers. How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were included in any of the 3 reports that we looked at earlier? 0, not one. And yet they claim to have interviewed 1,000 people. They missed these. Are these relevant? They're very relevant. Nist says it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Maybe it doesn't have to start at the bottom. Listen to Mark Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition, Inc.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a top-down controlled demolition. They can start anywhere they want. Nist also says, well, the top portion drove the rest of the building down to the ground and destroyed itself. This is called the crush down, crush up theory. But there's a problem here. It's called Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when 2 bodies collide. And that's evidenced intuitively, also understood by when you run a Mack truck into a Volkswagen. Which one crushes which one? The lightest is going to be crushed before perhaps even the radiator and the bumper of the Mack truck is crushed, right? Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck? No. It's the same phenomena. The lightest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below. This is like a virtual pyramid. At the top, we have fairly light steel, as thin as 3/8 inch thick. But then as we go down the structure, it gets thicker and thicker, even turning to box columns that are 2 inches thick at mid-height, 32 inches by 16 inches, as you see here. Incredible series of these massive core columns, which get thicker and thicker and thicker until at the bottom, it's almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches. So that's just not going to happen. So the theoretical basis for Nist's theory is given by Zdeněk Bazant from Chicago Northwestern University, a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Engineering and Mechanics, which was submitted, very complicated paper. and called the crush down, crush up theory, submitted just 2 days after 9/11. The rest of us were in shock about what was happening to our country. But this structural engineering and mathematics professor was busy trying to justify the official story in these 2 days, apparently. So it had to have been ready well before 9/11 is the speculation there. Nevertheless, what he's done here is use a formula which is correct, but the input data is falsified. You know, the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. There's 6 key problems here. Obfuscation is one of them. They made it so complicated that most engineers couldn't even figure out what was going on. Nevertheless, hardworking engineers decoded it recently. What they found was that they completely eliminated a whole story of columns to give the mathematical model a dynamic impact on the structure below, near the point of jet plane impacts, completely eliminating 287 columns. They doubled the mass up above, and they actually decreased the column strength below by a factor of 3. So they also decreased the velocity loss that would have been happening due to the law of conservation of momentum as soon as one floor hit another, for instance. And the column reserve strength was completely ignored. These columns are 3 times stronger than they need to be. So what they've done is rigged the model 12-to-1 at a minimum in favor of a collapse. This is fraud. And so we have challenged this fraud, and it is being reviewed at the top levels of the American Society of Civil Engineering. What really would happen is the downward movement would have been arrested after just 2 seconds of a collapse. So that's what the engineering that's honest shows. And the Bazant model shows that it came down even faster than it did, which is interesting. But we have the refutation of this by Tony Zambotti, Richard Johns, in a paper that was submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers, and on 2 occasions. And the problem is that this agency won't, or association won't, publish the paper. Why not? They say it's out of scope. Well, how can it be out of scope to publish a paper which shows gross errors in a previously published paper? This is also an ethical problem, which will be resolved in this challenge that I mentioned. Now let's look and see what happens. What does the video actually show when the upper part conflicts with the lower part? Let me make this easier for you. Watch the lower red line in this video. There's no downward motion from there. In other words, the upper part is not destroying the lower part. It's being destroyed itself, just like the Volkswagen would be. And the question we'll be looking at is what is destroying it exactly, because it becomes very interesting. And yes, we will look at these squibs down below in the future, because they're very interesting, of course. So if we start the collapse here and we stop, we see, just like the first responders described, a band of explosions all the way around the building. And that's what they heard. And the theory that they're trying to use to explain this is the column failure theory. As we mentioned, the perimeter columns are being pulled in, at least on the corner of the building, as we see in this looped video. right in the middle here, you can see that they're being pulled in. The question is, what is causing that? Is it sagging columns, as they claim, or is it something else? Well, let's go back to the leader of the Fema report before them and see what he uncovered that Nist covered back up.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started, and that tells us that the core columns let go first.
The core columns let go first. Is that really true? Because that's really important information. Watch the antenna at the top of the photograph go down, down, and then back, back. This is all before the perimeter goes down, 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 and back, back, forward, forward, back, back. It's falling at least 10, 20 feet. This is a 400-foot tall mast here. So what's that antenna sitting on? It's sitting on this hat truss. What's the hat truss sitting on? It's sitting on the core columns. So if the core columns fail, the hat truss descends before the perimeter columns, and the core columns are then going to pull on the floor trusses, and then the floor trusses pull on the perimeter columns. In this crude model, we can see something similar. The core columns are cut down below. That pulls on the floor trusses. The floor trusses then pull on the perimeter columns, causing them to bow inward, not bowing like we see here, but like we saw in the actual video. So also, in all of the photographs or videos, we do not see an upper part of this building driving the rest of the building down to the ground. It has been destroyed in the first 4 seconds, as we saw earlier. There's nothing left to drive the rest of the building down to the ground anyway. And if there was, we would not see these few 8 to 10 core columns remaining 1,000 feet in the air. They would have been crushed by that massive block of 15 stories in the case of the North Tower. But no, here they remain for 6 seconds until something else destroys them from down below, shaking the dust off of them, and then it descends through the dust. Frame by frame, we see the top of this mast descending through the dust, which is shaken off of it. And does it even look like a collapse? World Trade Center 1 on the left, a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea is what it looks more like. Upward, outward, arching streamers, freely flying structural objects, trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll get to in next week's part 3 of this 3-part series. Because we know structural steel is not flammable under these conditions. So what are we looking at here with this massive series of trailing thick white smoke clouds from non-flammable beams? Does this look anything like a gravitational collapse? Or have you been led astray by the description? You're told it's a banana, but it's an orange. And because we were in shock, all of us, we just simply believe it. Our cognitive faculties have been suspended in a psychological operation against the American people of shock and awe. And for the most part, it worked. But there's millions in the 9/11 truth movement, spurred on by initial reports like these 36 reporters who were witnesses, many of them themselves, of explosions, and who heard reports from the FBI, the FDNY, the police department of explosions that day. But then this whole story changed the next day when the national media began to take over, and the agencies like Reuters and AP took over the story. So this is an article written by Ted Walter and Graham McQueen. They conclude that the hypothesis of explosions bringing down the towers was not only prevalent among reporters, but was the dominant hypothesis that day. Number 3, do we have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint? Well, let's look at these towers. As we can see, the south tower begins to lean over, actually, which is very relevant because it's at 22 degrees off center and falling off the axis. So we have asymmetrical loading on the structure below from this part that's falling off. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. Why in the world then do we have complete symmetry later on all the way down that tower, the south tower? It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense given what we've seen up above. In fact, let's zoom in and see what we can learn here. The leading corner of this so-called gravitational collapse, the floors are supposedly pancaking 20 stories up above. But in this leading corner, what do we see right before our very eyes? Hundreds of explosions is what I see. From another perspective, in the lower right corner, we see those explosions leading the way, traveling almost as fast as the freely falling debris to the right of it. We'll get back to that speed of destruction in a moment. The destruction is 1,200 to 1,400 feet wide. We only have a 200-foot wide building. So what's really happening here? It's a huge dispersion of steel, which we'll get to in a moment. But for now, it is symmetrical. In fact, the winter gardens are completely destroyed well outside what should have been a pancaking collapse. 600 feet to the west, it's destroyed. The steel frame is completely broken up. We have the perimeters of these buildings seen here, and we have the entire World Trade Center complex being filled with an equal distribution of steel. Compare that to the nice, neat pile that we looked at last week, World Trade Center Building 7, a classic implosion, versus the very explosive event that the Twin Towers were. Let's look at the ejection of these building materials. This is rather extraordinary. 20 stories below here, up to 60 stories below the advancing collapse, as they call it. We have all of these squibs 60 stories below. Where are they coming from? Are they mistimed explosions? What can explain them? The official story, or Nist, tells us that, well, these are puffs of air being produced by that pile driver, which is pushing down air through the elevator hoistways, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, no, these are not puffs of air. They're solids. You can see the solids in these ejections. And if it were, when we saw the upper part was destroyed anyway in the first 4 seconds, so there's no piston to drive that air down through the elevator hoistways anyway. But even if there was, it would have filled this open office planning that we looked at earlier, full of uniform air pressure. And if it blew out any of the windows, it would blow them all out. Not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that we see here. And in the South Tower on the left side, right at the beginning of its destruction, we see dozens of squibs or isolated explosive ejections. What in the official story can possibly explain these isolated explosive ejections occurring almost simultaneously. Nothing. Let's go to the physics teacher, David Chandler, and as he explains for us what is going on here.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the south tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour, that's 160 to 200 feet per second. These are explosive speeds, not air propulsion from a natural collapse. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go back to an analysis here. On the left, the video. On the right, a computer model. Here's 5 seconds. 10 seconds is coming up. Yeah, in about 12 seconds, that jumped kind of a little bit, but in about 12 seconds, both towers are completely destroyed down to the bottom. We have an analysis, again, by physics teacher David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall. It is getting faster and faster and faster. It's not slowing down. This is not deceleration, it's acceleration. Every second it's getting faster. Straight down through what? Through all of this steel. There's more steel on the facade of this building than glass. How in the world is that possible? Not to mention the core columns, which are massive. So it's not even slowing down. Now, that makes no sense when you understand how these steel columns are designed. They are designed, well, the properties of steel from which they are designed are such that even when they start buckling, they never lose all of their strength. There is a minimum resistance of 25%, typically. And so at a minimum, it would slow down as 25% of the reserve column strength is reached in the plastic phase of buckling. So it can't accelerate. It's physically impossible. Let's look at it another way. Intuitively, we take a giant crane and hold up one section on the right, 15 stories of this massive building over nothing but air. Same portion of the 15-story section on the left. And let's put under it a steel structure that's designed 5 times stronger than it needs to be to keep that structure up above from ever going anywhere, crushing itself. We'll even give it that false 12 feet of head start by removing those columns between the two bodies so it can get a dynamic load going. We release a dynamic impact. We release the cranes and drop these both at once. What happens? Well, a 7th grader can understand that the building portion on the right, which has no resistance, will fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, with a little bit more wind resistance, which is negligible. The one on the left is going to hit, crush, probably crush a little bit, and maybe fall off the building. Who knows? but it's not going to fall as fast as the one on the right. It's going to slow down. Let's look at it another way with Massimo Mazzucco's September 11th New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with two towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by Nist.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
So this fraud was challenged yet again, and this time published by a different agency, the International Journal of Protected Structures in Multi-Science Publishing. So we have some efforts that have been rewarded on the part of those trying to provide the truth scientifically. Do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame? Feature number 6 of controlled demolition. Well, the National Fire Protection Association 921, the guide for fire and explosion investigation used by agencies not only in the US but around the world largely, says look for effects of explosions like shrapnel effects, like high order damage characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished and debris thrown great distances. Do we have that? Indeed, we do. We're looking at it right here, all the way down to the ground. One column set, in the case of the perimeter columns, from another, and the core columns completely dismantled, destroyed into a pile only 2 stories or so high. The only remaining intact pieces are those shards, if you will, at near the base of each of these structures. So the steel frame is completely shattered. The columns are reduced to their original lengths. How about the lateral ejection of structural steel? This is interesting. We go back to NFPA 921. And they say, look for blast pressure wave effects. Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying. This is exactly what we have, again, destroying 500 to 600 feet away at the Winter Gardens and impaling themselves on buildings. And as you can see here in this series of stops and starts or stepping videos, we have structural steel pieces landing 300 to 600 feet in every direction, including this one. Whoa, back to, forward to. This is a freely flying structural steel piece about to hit World Trade Center 7, which Nist acknowledged was not the cause of its collapse. Nevertheless, here it is, 45 degrees. It starts out horizontal, but then gravity takes over. Well, gravity works down. This should have been going down from the beginning, not shot out, ejected, or launched by some unknown force, if you read the official story. But a known force, if you stay with us and learn more about what could possibly have caused these horizontal ejections. Let's go to David Chandler, again, physics teacher.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units. which was being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
This is enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. What are we talking about? What kind of energy has been developed to accomplish that? And since the steel has been distributed so far outside the footprint of each of these buildings, 100,000 tons of it, a third of the weight of the building, what's crushing the building? It's not the steel. You say, oh, maybe it's the concrete floors. We'll look at that in a moment. In fact, we'll look at it right now because we're missing about 110 floors that should be stacked up. We don't see 50 of them. We don't see 10 of them. We don't see one of them in these photographs. Here's a real pancaking collapse where you see the pancakes, but not in the World Trade Center. What happened to the concrete? Oh, there it is, pulverized in midair during the collapse. All the photographs, all the videos show the 90,000 tons of concrete missing from each of the building, but they show them being pulverized, and pulverized to what? 100 micron particles on average. It's pulverized to a fine powder, and that powder is laying 3 inches thick across lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area. In fact, up to 30% of the dust, the World Trade Center dust, is pulverized powder. Let's go to the governor.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
There was 90,000 tons of concrete unaccounted for, other than in this blanket of dust. And so it didn't go crush the building either. It's been pulverized and spread well outside the footprint of the building. So here's another third of the weight of that building. So if 2/3 the weight of this building is not capable of crushing the rest of the building, what destroyed the building? They did find one file cabinet out of about 10,000 steel file cabinets that were in that building. This one survived because it was in the basement. It's from an ice cream store. What kind of destructive force are we talking about? We'd expect to find file cabinets certainly damaged and flattened maybe, but this is the only one they could find. What about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found on top of this building, a half an inch long. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because hitting the South Tower because its ejections went out the other side. They didn't come from the people in the North Tower, the plane that hit the North Tower, because those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower. Let's go deeper. So they're not from the people in the planes. Many of them were from firefighters, which you can see by the red triangles in the mapping. So, but the firefighters were not on the scene, of course, at the time of the plane impacts. So it wasn't from the people on the planes. So what's going on here? There were 2,753 victims lost at the World Trade Center, officially. Only 300 whole bodies were found. So what about everybody else? 21,900 pieces of bodies found altogether. And this is interesting. Hold on one second. We're going to reload the PowerPoint so we don't have that problem again. Here we go. Okay. So 21,000 pieces of bodies found. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. How does that make any sense? But we're still missing. By the way, 200 pieces were matched to one single person, and they were spread all over the place. 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for, not even a piece small enough to fit into a test tube. They were vaporized. This cannot be explained. The victim data tracking database shows that they were spread 800 feet outside each of the towers, up to that far. Small pieces of bodies way out here. How does a pancaking collapse, a gravitational collapse, explain such pulverization and distribution? It can't possibly. Fire doesn't explain it. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. The fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically, with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance and never in a steel frame fireproofed skyscraper. Speaking of those fires, especially these fires, which are diminished at the time of the collapse, ready to go out. So with additional circumstantial and corroborative testimony, such as additional work performed by, again, Graham McQueen in 2015, documenting not 118, but now 156 total witnesses of explosions from the first responders. There's another witness, and that's the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north of World Trade Center, which picked up signals, seismic signals which FEMA and Nist relied on from the Columbia University, which runs that seismic station, because there were signals near the time of the plane impacts, and the official source of information tells us that these were due to the plane impacts. But if we look closer, we find something else. There's a 0.9 magnitude impact near the impact of the North Tower. Let's look at it carefully. And a 0.7 magnitude event at the second impact near the South Tower, which Nist says is also due to the plane impacting that building. But since we have witnesses that heard pre-airplane impact explosions, which we'll show you in a moment, let's look carefully, because the seismic event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But the airplane impact, according to the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board radar, which is accurate to within a second, says the plane didn't hit until 14 seconds after that. So what does Nist do with this information? Well, they first say, well, we don't think that radar is accurate. We think it happened 10 seconds earlier. Well, wait a minute. You say you looked at the videos and you examined recordings and you came up with a 10-second earlier? How accurate might that have been? But they're still 10 seconds off. So what do they do then? They're still 4 seconds off from the seismic event. They go to LDEO, Columbia University, and get them to move their data back 3 seconds so it can be more in uniformity with their theory, with their claim. Can we see that report? No, it's not available from a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, because it's a university, not a government agency. We should be able to see it. Same thing at the South Tower. We have the impact, the seismic event occurring at 9:02 and 54 seconds that morning. But the plane impacts, according to the 1 second accurate NTSB radar, says this plane hit 17 seconds later. Wait a minute. What's Nist going to do with this? Nope, we don't believe you. NTSB radar, we think it hit 12 seconds earlier, which is 5 seconds after. Well, they're still 5 seconds off. What do they do with that? They go back to LDEO again and get them to move their data back 3 seconds in a report that is not public. So we don't get to know how that happened. That gives you a sense of what's going on there. But we do have witnesses that corroborate the original LDEO report and the NTSB radar. Mike Picoro is a witness that a bomb went off in the building in the sea level of the basement. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press completely blown up. That they made their way to the parking garage, found too that it was gone. There were no walls, rubble on the floor. You can't see anything. The steel and concrete fire door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil. A bomb had gone off in the basement. Well, this is the testimony of Willie Rodriguez, janitor at the World Trade Center, and here's his testimony about a bomb going off before the plane impacted the building.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Hold on 1 second. Need names. Okay. So there's some more witnesses of pre-impact explosions. Here's another one. Not a witness, but a applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology, says the frequency of Rayleigh waves attributed by LDEO to the impacts were on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. Aircraft impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz and often up to 100 hertz, 2 orders of magnitude greater. But those frequencies, these high frequencies, are filtered out by the bandpass filters used by LDEO. So they couldn't even have allowed for the recording of such high frequency waves. So he says the seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. So the seismic signals are not from the airplane impacts. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened before even hitting the ground. In other words, they wouldn't even have made it to the seismic station. Okay, let's look at the collapses, because there were also seismic signals occurring near the time of the collapse, producing a 2.1 magnitude event at the South Tower and a 2.3 magnitude event at the North Tower. Let's dig into it. We have the surface waves coming into the LDEO at 10:28 and 31 seconds. And this is calculated back so that at the site, it would be 10:28 and 31 seconds. The tower starts its descent at 10:28 and 22 seconds, which is 9 seconds before that. And the first debris starts hitting the ground about 1 second after that event. So are the surface waves making this event? No. The heaviest debris strikes the pavement at 10:28 and 36 seconds, which is 4 seconds later. So what does Nist do with this 4-second discrepancy, since they're citing the seismic event with equating it with the heaviest debris striking the ground? Well, they go back to LDEO yet a third time, get them to move their data back again 3 seconds, which is documented in a report that we, the public, don't have access to. We call this fraud, by the way. It has a name. Not only to mention that they completely ignore the very well-defined primary and secondary or shear waves that are occurring before the Raleigh waves, the big Raleigh waves. So these are completely ignored by LDEO, indicating that something happened. 4 seconds before the tower started descending, this well-defined primary wave begins. So how does that happen? Well, let's find out with the research that shows that there were cameras that were tripod mounted on the ground watching the North Tower before its collapse. 6 and 10 seconds before the tower even started descending, we have evidence of explosions from this camera mounted tripod. In this case, 6 seconds. This is per the work of Professor Graham Queen, did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground? Well, before it even started descending, in fact. Let's watch. Here is the shake right there. And 6 seconds later, the North Tower begins its descent. And in another location, a tripod on a roof a little higher up, we have a shake that occurs right about there on this tripod mounted camera. And then there's an explosion on the top of the building. And then the entire building begins its descent, smooth, sudden, like we saw before. Same thing in the South Tower, by the way. We have the start of the seismic event at 9:59 and 04 seconds. But the tower starts its collapse 5 seconds before that. And the first debris doesn't even hit the ground until 7 seconds later. So how can even the first debris be responsible, much less the heaviest debris? Well, Nist goes back to LDEO again and gets them to move their data back to align with their claim that the seismic signals are produced by the collapse. A fourth time. Again, fraudulent. But there's an answer to all of this. There's a New York 1 TV camera shake on a tripod, also at the South Tower, which occurs, in this case, 3 seconds before the start of the tower collapse, corroborating the first responders in each of these cases, by the way, that heard and saw and experienced explosions before the tower collapsed. So their testimony is corroborated by these tripod mounted cameras. Let's go to TV 1, New York 1 TV. And this one's more subtle. In fact, I missed it. There's the beginning of the collapse. Let's go back and start that one yet again. Watch very carefully. There's the shake. And 3 seconds later, the initiation of the collapse. So the official narrative is that the seismic signals are due to the debris hitting the ground. But guess what? The concrete, 1/3 the weight of the building, is not hitting the ground at all. We saw that it was pulverized into a fine powder, which is spread over 3 square miles. No seismic component. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, peppering the ground over a 15-second period. And they're just 4 to 8 tons each. So there's no group of them that's massively hitting the ground. And they're not even hitting the ground, but the top of a 7-story basement. So further isolating it from seismic components reaching 20 miles away. So, and they're equally distributed over this entire superblock as well. And so here's another point. We have identical collapses from identical buildings producing extremely different results seismically. One is 1.5 times greater in energy release than the other. 2.1 magnitude on the South Tower, 2.3 in the North Tower. On the logarithmic scale, that's 1.6 times greater energy. So that can't be accounted for either by the collapses. It can only be accounted for by something else, which we've been looking at evidence of explosions. And Andre Rousseau tidies this up for us. Identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude, he says. Well, this evidence is nicely summarized on the Consensus 9/11, the 9/11 Best Evidence Panel, point TT7, Twin Towers 7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. I encourage you to look at that work by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. Some people say, well, the Twin Towers should have produced way more seismic reaction than the Seattle Kingdom. Well, we're not comparing apples to apples here at all. In the case of the Seattle Kingdom, we have a 25,000-ton concrete roof impacting the ground virtually at once. In the case of the Twin Towers, we saw that the steel was distributed outside, peppering the ground over 15 seconds, and not even the ground, but the parking structure. The concrete was pulverized to a fine powder, no seismic component whatsoever. And so this analogy makes no sense, produced by people who have, in my opinion, questionable motives. So we encourage you to do this research on your own. You can look at these sources and learn quite a bit more about the seismic evidence there. So let's look at the FEMA and Nist reports. We did look at the FEMA report earlier. The Nist report had $20 million, and they were tasked by Congress to explain how and why the World Trade Center high-rises collapsed. But they didn't. They have their own objective, in fact, hidden on footnote 13 in page 82. On page 82, the focus of the investigation, they say, was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You have 10,000 pages of report, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes. And you couldn't even do what other engineers since have done and calculate the ability of the structure below the point of jet plane impacts to resist the structure collapsing from above. You condense that into a half page. Let's look at it. Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait a minute. This is pure speculation. No calculations whatsoever, save those fraudulent calculations which remain the key theoretical basis for Nist's column failure theory from Zdenek Bazant from Chicago Northwestern University in that paper that was submitted just 2 days after 9/11 and was so complicated that most engineers couldn't even understand it. This is a pre-collapse report. It should have been titled "The Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse of the World Trade Center Towers." So we submitted a request for correction, as you can do when fraud like this is committed by agencies of the U.S. government. And they write back, "We were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers." You know, we do agree completely. And Nist found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. They also said, well, they write back a year later and admit, "We didn't test for the presence of explosive residue." You'll never find what you won't look for. But others looked for it, and we'll be looking at it next week in part 3 of this series. Until then, we look at a few of the experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion as to how the towers came down. Like William Rice, for instance, the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself. While crushing 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 tons or more of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, near free fall collapse violates the laws of physics. You can memorize that one. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All 3 collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Van Romero, explosive expert in New Mexico Tech, said that explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the airplanes hit the trade center, there were explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Mathis Levy, who before joining the Fema team had this to say.
Many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
But somebody got to him, as they did Van Romero, apparently, because these individuals have federal grants, presumably. That's the reason. And Ronald Hamburger also, who before joining the Fema team said, "It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised." Well, we saw all kinds of evidence for bombs having been detonated. Mike Taylor, the collapse of the World Trade Center towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. They mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. In controlled demolition, explosives are placed not just on the lowest floors, but also on several consecutive floors, about a third of the way up the building. It cascaded down like an implosion. And Andre Rousseau, whom we're familiar with now, even if the planes plane impacts, and the fall of debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 34 kilometers away. That's 20 miles. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. How about the evidence? We have experts like this structural engineer complaining about the preservation of evidence which was not happening.
after 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, we have up to 400 truckloads per day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, carted to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which is why so many architects, engineers, and millions of others, through the use of the scientific method, have arrived at the hypothesis that not jet planes and fires brought down the buildings, but explosions and controlled demolitions. Because they believe that what has been shown here is today anyway, the 8 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features also of controlled demolition. And that this is not evidence of destruction from fires. Fires don't cause any of these features, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and evidence. This, to so many, is proof of controlled demolition. And that's why we ask you to join us. But you might have questions at this point also. Why don't you, Andy, can you let people know how to ask these questions for those viewers that are live today?
Absolutely. Always ask questions. And you can do that by submitting any questions that you have in the input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org, and just go under continuing education and find the live webinars. You'll see a box right there, and we will do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
And while you're there, thanks, Andy, and please subscribe to our newsletter at ae911truth.org. Just take 1 minute to put your name in there and your email, and then you'll be up to date with the latest evidence that we've got, the latest efforts we're making and progress we're making toward getting a real investigation. You can just get informed also. We have an incredible evidence site on the website, so take advantage of that too, and sign the petition while you're there. Even if you're not an architect or engineer, you can support them with your signature. We have 20,000 others supporting the 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. And donate too. We're supported only by you. Small donations form the vast majority of the work. They create that work that we're able to do all across the country in speaking engagements, outreach to media and newspapers and Congress and engineers, the academic field, the universities. We do it all. And it's only because people like you are supporting us. In fact, many become members of AE 911 Truth. Encourage you to do that for as little as a cup of coffee a month. You can join the family of sustaining supporters. And hey, if you can't do that, there's still things you can do, like volunteering, right, Andy?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to be a part of something important and big, then the best way to do it is to volunteer, and we can always use help on various projects, and we've got different things you can do depending on what kind of personality type you are, whether you like to reach out and talk to someone or whether or not you just want to do quiet research. We can use those skills. So please, if you're bringing your hands over this information and wondering what to do about it, but you can't think of anything, you can contact us, fill out a very short form at ae911truth.org, and we can get you involved.
Yeah, and you can do stuff on your own too. Contact your own elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers. Tell everybody you know. You can screen the DVDs to groups of colleagues. Find architects and engineers in your neighborhood. Give them the brochures that we have. We can get 100 of them for $10 in our store at ae911truth.org. You can download the Building 7 finite element analysis from Professor Leroy Hulsey that we talked about last week in this 3-part series. That was part 1. They have proven that the Nist report is fraud, basically. And through a detailed series of a finite element analysis using the same materials and values that Nist used so they could compare apples to apples, finding that no way this building came down by fire. In fact, the only way it came down was to remove all the columns in the building at once. That doesn't happen by fire. So that documentary is about that project is out now. You can see it at Amazon.com. You can find that more easily by visiting our website, ae911truth.org. It's right up at the top. You can link over and watch it on Amazon, and I think Vudu also, those types of places. And know that we have submitted a request for correction to Nist yet again on the results of the Hulsey study, the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, having conducted this 4-year, $300,000 study, which is so important to the world to disprove, not just Building 7. You disprove Building 7, you disprove the entire conspiracy that is 9/11. And so we encourage you to get on the phone. In fact, we're going to do it for you. How does that work, Andy?
It's very important to get on the phone, especially now with everybody locked down. The one benefit is that we have even a stronger reach in some instances with Congress, which is where our aims have always been with our petition calling on Congress to reinvestigate the destruction of these 3 towers. So if the question is, how do we get in touch with them? You can contact us at congress@ae911truth.org. We can give you some advice. But all you got to do is do the outreach. Go to your congressman's website. They usually have a form that you can fill out with a drop down on there that says you're doing a meeting request and request a phone meeting. You can do it with yourself, other constituents in your area, and say that you want to have members of AE 911 Truth on the phone. And we love doing this. We love talking to these staffers, hearing the tone in their voice as they watch Building 7 fall for the first time and pleading our case, talking about why we need this new investigation. And it's not going to happen unless this work gets done. And we could do the outreach ourselves. The problem is they want to listen to you. They want to hear from you, your constituents. We're just a couple of guys from out of their district. So that's why you are so important in this process. So please consider getting involved in that. And the name of the act that we are ultimately going to get passed is the Bobby McElveen World Trade Center Investigation Act. Right now it's draft legislation that would establish a select committee, can be put through in any house of the U.S. Congress, and it would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do, look into the evidence that Richard has been presenting all of these years. And as I always point out, it's written in such a way that they can't just regurgitate the same talking points and say that they reinvestigated. They actually have to look into the possibility that nanothermite was used to bring down the towers. And of course, it's named after Bobby McElveen, who was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower that morning. So everything is in place. We just need you out there to get involved, all the soldiers, to put on that needed pressure on our members of Congress that are doing so.
Lost you there, Andy. Was there more, or is that it?
Oh, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I thought you died out at the end. Were you done?
I believe I am. Yes.
Okay.
I don't know how much of that you heard at the end. So
no, it just sort of trailed off. So if you were done, I think we heard it all. So encourage everybody to be inspired by the fact that we did submit 60 exhibits of this evidence to the U.S. attorney, and he's offered to comply in writing with the law that requires him to submit this evidence to a special grand jury. So we have sued them now to prove that they've done that, and we're involved in a legal process about it, as we are with the FBI lawsuit, where they have provided a motion to dismiss, saying the families don't have standing in our negligence to give the information that we have, that Congress required us to give to them, after the 9/11 Commission report. And they indeed had much of our evidence, which we have proven. So indeed, they're on the hook here, and we're expecting results there. This month, we finally submit the application for a new inquest into the death of Jeff Campbell, who died as a result of explosions that we've been talking about the evidence of today. That evidence has also been submitted, is going to be submitted by one of the top attorneys in the UK, and Nick Stanage, and of Doughty Street Chambers, and that's going to raise a lot of feathers as family members join on and demand a new inquest into their loved ones' death as well, because they claim, of course, that jet plane impacts and fires brought the buildings down, and we've disproven that. And much of that proof is embedded in a documentary, which you can watch. I want to give you just a minute of the taste of it. It's extraordinary because we've included 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence that you're seeing in this 3-part series. So it's even more compelling than me talking for an hour or two. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what Nist has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as Nist, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
Nist has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
Nist excluded the documents from Fema in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
Nist concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
if this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime, evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, you can watch this exciting documentary on YouTube for free, the 1 hour version. You can also watch the 90-minute version by getting the DVD. It comes also with a bonus disc. Lots of additional material on the DVD, as well as the Meet the Experts bonus disc, which includes additional, like 2 hours of additional interviews from these experts. So I encourage you to take a deep look at that and learn as much as you can. You can also do that by looking at the 50-page Beyond Misinformation booklet, which is an incredible coffee table, high quality magazine type book. And that is also downloadable for free at beyondmisinformation.org. So either way, and you can watch for free the classic lecture that we've done, the 2-hour lecture, the research edition on YouTube, and also the 15-minute version of World Trade Center 7, Solving the Mystery, narrated by actor Ed Asner. So maybe there are some questions today, Andy. I don't know.
Yeah, we do have 5 questions. The first one asks, question for Richard or Andy. Have you tried reaching out to the various state architect licensing boards about petitioning for a new investigation? Public comments have to be included in licensing board meetings and the board members vote. I know you have petitioned AIA to no avail, but you might make some headway with the state licensing boards. Thanks.
You know, that has not been done. It's worth doing just to get it on the record, like you say. The licensing boards, I like that idea. Just for due diligence, you know, if nothing else. The licensing boards are responsible for credentialing the individual architects. They're going to tell us clearly that this is outside of their scope, and why don't I take this elsewhere, like so many agencies do. But I think it is nevertheless a worthy idea, and frankly, I haven't thought of it for those reasons, but it's not like we're running out of things to do. We're making a new film now, which is very exciting, and there's always something that's taking up our attention that is the project of the moment. But I'm going to add this one to the stack, and I really appreciate the suggestion. In fact,
absolutely.
Andy, we could get our architects in each state. In fact, the particular city, the capital, is usually where the licensing boards are. Sacramento, in the case of California. And so we find an architect in Sacramento willing to go down there with our materials and make a little, I don't know, may give them 2 or 3 minutes presentation.
Yeah, we can talk about it tomorrow. And if the person who wrote this, see, the thing is, it was a Facebook comment question, and there's this weird thing going on where the Facebook comments disappear for me. I don't know why. So I saved this. So I don't know who it is that has this, unfortunately. But if you have some insider knowledge of this process or involved in some way, you can contact us. info@e911truth.org, and then you can let us know who you are and tell us what information you have.
Cool.
So our next question asks, do you know if Bazant included the steel and the concrete that were airborne as part of the mass responsible for crushing down on the mass below?
Yes, they sure did. They not only accounted for the steel above the point of jet plane impacts. There's, I'm just estimating, 20,000 tons of steel. No, let's say 10,000. 1/8 of the building's weight in the 15 stories above the point of jet plane impacts. they not only add that, but they made it 3 or 4 times more massive to try to crush the structure below, which they made 3 times or 4 times, I can't remember right now, less massive. We discussed this earlier today. So they've completely committed fraud here. Besant in particular, we're talking about now. Do you think that answers the question, Andy?
I think it does. I mean, I shouldn't be explored too much because Besant is totally wrong. So it's like trying to argue about the boogeyman under your bed here. But it's really interesting. I had to look at a picture from Besant's paper for a project that I'm doing, and it's kind of funny to see how he portrays the top block as just crushing the whole thing, and then all of a sudden it just disappears at the very end of it, like a magic show.
Yeah, and that concrete was pulverized to a fine powder, so there was no component from it whatsoever that is available to crush the building below. Same with the steel. It's expelled laterally up to 600 feet, as we saw.
Exactly. So our next question says, what is the evidence that the seismic results were changed due to a request by Nist?
That slide that I showed you showed the date of the report that was produced. I think it was, actually, I don't remember the date. Let's see how fast I am. The only evidence I have is right there, and I'm going to attempt to find it right now. Let's see how good I am. I can whip back through my slides quite effectively. In fact, here we are. Right. Wait. Not there. Here. Yes. So, what we see is NC star 1-5A. Here, I'll circle it. Page 22 and 23. Now, this is Nist contracted with LDEO in 2005. Now, 2005 is after the report came out. Well, it's the same year the report came out. So maybe it was early in that year. Anyway, that's your evidence right there. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, the next, well, it's more of a comment from YouTube, and it's about Building 7, but I think it's applicable enough for today, so I'm going to include it. It says, I love the approach that Mr. Gage uses. The building number 7, it's really the smoking gun, and many people don't know about Building 7. I just want to add amen to that, and you're liable to hear a lot of chatter out there in the next coming year as we get more successful of people trying to come in to the movement and say, no, don't look at Building 7. Look at all of this other stuff that the 9/11 Commission acknowledged that has nothing to do with physics and common sense and science. Don't look at Building 7 because we don't know who put the charges in there. So what can you do? Well, you can look at it and prove that it's physically impossible for this building to come down the way that it did. So it is absolutely the smoking gun of 9/11. And I wouldn't listen to anybody tell you otherwise because they just want you to look away from the most clear-cut evidence that we were lied to about that day. Richard?
Yeah, a lot of people think science is so far over my head. You know, I can't even comprehend, not a lot of people, but there are some, what you're saying. But most people, at least with a 7th grade education, can get what we're talking about today. So yeah, we stick with it. It's pretty cold, hard, and irrefutable and overwhelming evidence.
Okay, the last comment/question says, I know you guys have proven beyond all doubt no plane brought down Building 7. But how do we break the corporate media blockade on this information? Richard, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, I'm going to need your help too, Andy, because this is tough because we know that in this country, at least 95% of the mainstream media is owned by just 5 corporations. Now, who controls those corporations is the question, and it turns out to be through Project Censored out of Sonoma State University. They have done the research, and they find that these corporations are controlled by the same people who control the corporations in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all of whom profited enormously from 9/11. So we have a huge problem that's cited in this question, and it's like anything. The Vietnam War was only brought to a close when people got really upset about it, and they showed up in the streets en masse, and they voted politicians out of office that voted for going to war. And that is what is necessary. And it's very difficult in this day and age because politics is very different now. It's actually far worse. And people don't have as much of a voice as they had. And those with a voice who are exercising it by becoming their own media are being deplatformed on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. And the algorithms hurt us who are speaking the truth on those platforms. And so we reach out everywhere as much as we can, and we rely on you, the viewer of our podcasts and the reader of our materials, to act, because I can reach 1,000 of you through this podcast right now, but I can't reach your friends. I rely on you to do that. Andy?
Yeah, I kind of look at it as sort of 3 tiers of it because I've been dealing with this for years. And I remember when this first started up, AE 9/11 Truth and 9/11 Truth movement. I mean, you would have people on Fox News try to go after members of the 9/11 Truth movement, try to even put out the idea that it was somehow dangerous to raise these questions. And it's very easy to take it personally and get really charged up and angry. But I just advise, don't let that happen within you. Don't take it personally because they're just doing a job. And so you got to do your job. And don't burn energy getting mad about it. It's actually more fun to engage them. And so sort of the second tier is when you engage them, be professional, already know what you're going to say. And if you can get onto the air anyway, don't go doing something crazy like trying to interrupt a program or something. But if there's something where they're taking live questions, just have your question ready and make sure it's about Building 7 and worry about trying to wake up the people in the audience more so than your target, just like we did with C-SPAN every day. And that was powerful because people stuck to the plan and got the words out there, and really, I think, made a big difference. And then into the third tier of it is that you got to support alternative media. And it's easy to get disheartened right now because of what's happening on YouTube and on Facebook and all of that. But, I'm one of the old timers who comes from the days before there was a Facebook and before YouTube was what it is now. I mean, when I first started doing this, you couldn't even get a video onto YouTube longer than 15 minutes. You had to break up movies like Loose Change into 15-minute segments and then upload it that way. So we all had to go to different platforms and just readjust and recalculate and our approach. And, if YouTube's blocking you, go to BitChute. It's a very good site for sharing information. They don't censor anybody. If Facebook is blocking you, go to one of the new ones like MeWe is a new one I've heard about, and just take the battle there. And if you can get off of these platforms and just reach out to people any way that you can. I did it one time through a local news station. They had this thing called UNews, where local people are supposed to upload videos of things going on in the neighborhood around them. Most of it was just people taking pictures of squirrels in their yard and uploading it there. Well, I had gone to New York City with AE to do some activities, and I filmed it. And so there's the local connection. I went there, and I'm local, and I just put it up with the big headline: explosives brought down the Twin Towers in Building 7 on 9/11. And next morning, this video had the most comments of anything that had ever been put on UNews. It just created this huge buzz and arguments going on. And so you just got to just take the effort and do those things. Now, they pulled the video afterwards, but we made them have to do that. But you're just going out and participating and using whatever media is available to you if they let you be a part of it. And don't worry about them trying to make you uncomfortable or whatever. You're on the side of truth. And just got to remember that. Don't back down.
To never back down. All right. Thanks, Andy. And today we're looking at the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 2 of our 3-part series. Next week, we launch into the Twin Towers in extreme heat, which will be looking at the fires in more detail, the pyroclastic-like clouds, as a term from a volcano, with extreme heat. It can't be possibly accounted for by the official story. Molten steel and iron all over the place. Iron microspheres, evidence of thermite incendiaries and nanothermite. The evidence we'll be looking at along with a peer-reviewed paper next week. So don't miss it. And if you do, you can catch it on YouTube for free. Just Google what you see here. Search in YouTube 9/11 An Architect's Guide Part 3, Twin Towers in Extreme Heat. Otherwise, we'll see you here at 1 p.m. Thursday. And that'll complete our work. And by the way, just so you know, I may be in New York a week from today, which means we would have this particular webinar in 2 weeks as opposed to in 1 week from now. So be aware of that, but you can catch it on YouTube yourself. Until then, I'd like to thank everybody, and Andy particularly, for joining us and helping me. And we'll catch up with you hopefully next week or the week after.